Reflections on the Good News of Jesus Christ for the 11th Sunday of Ordinary Time from the Gospel of Mark. Jesus said to the crowds, "This is how it is with the kingdom of God. It is as if a man were to scatter seed on the land and would sleep and rise night and day, and through it all the seed would sprout and grow, he knows not how. Of its own accord, the land yields fruit, first the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. And when the grain is ripe, he wields the sickle at once, for the harvest has come." Jesus said, "To what shall we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable can we use for it? It is like a mustard seed that, when it is sown in the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds on the earth. But once it is sown, it springs up and becomes the largest of plants and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the sky can dwell in its shade." With many such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to understand it. Without parables, he did not speak to them, but to his own disciples he explained everything in private. The good news of the Lord. Some years ago, I lived in an apartment where a small balcony gave me the space to grow a few plants. Once, when I was watering them, I noticed a tiny sprout that didn't look like a weed, so I decided to leave it alone and see what would come of it. It didn't take long before I realized that what was growing was not a weed, but rather the beginning of a redwood tree. Its tiny seed, actually smaller than a mustard seed, having drifted on the wind from a grove of redwoods not far away, themselves more than 200 feet tall. God gave that tiny seed all that it needed to grow into a towering giant of a tree, far bigger than any mustard plant, just as God has given us all that we need to grow into God's loving family, caring deeply for each other and for the world around us. Yes, attention is necessary, and care must be taken, just as with plants. But for several years, I enjoyed the everyday miracle of watching that tiny sprout grow into a redwood tree. You look up for a moment from whatever it is you are doing, and you watch her changing your daughter's diaper. As she rubs the baby with powder, she wiggles her nose against the baby's, and both mom and baby giggle in delight. You file this image away in the place in your heart where you store such visions, visions of everyday miracles. Early on, you realized that your favorite place on earth is the earth. Whether a few oversized pots on the porch of your first apartment, or the garden you sectioned off in the yard behind your present house, you find great fulfillment in making things grow. And the best part is sharing the bounty with those you love. Flowers for her, corn for the kids, tomatoes and carrots for the parish food pantry. The good earth is filled with such everyday miracles. There are so many demands on your time. If nothing else, you could use those few hours to get a head start on the week's projects, and maybe get an extra hour or two of sleep some night as a result. But you kept that afternoon or evening free to tutor struggling students at the community center, or be part of the crew at the soup kitchen, or coach your child's soccer team. To be sure, many people appreciate the time you give, but you also know that it's good for you now and then to stretch your soul to work an everyday miracle. The joy of life comes from our efforts at bringing about such everyday miracles, or using Jesus' image, making the kingdom of God a bit more real. But first, this requires a bit of explanation. Kingdom in the gospel does not refer to a place either here or hereafter. So it is not heaven. You know, pie in the sky, by and by, after you die, if you've been a good guy. Nor is the kingdom the same as the church. It is primarily an environment, a set of relationships, a reality in which God's values prevail. And what are God's values? In practice, they are the deepest human values and aspirations as mirrored in the life of Jesus, who is himself the revelation of God to us in human form. These values include truth, love, mercy, compassion, justice, a set of solidarity with all other human beings, a sense of trust in one another, a deep respect for the dignity of every human person. And of course, all these are seen in the light of God, who is their ultimate source. It is to be like God and with God that we live according to these values. They, with and through Jesus, are our link with the one Jesus calls Abba, Father. People who individually and collectively try to live these values belong with Jesus to the kingdom of God. And by the way, such people may or may not belong to the church. As St. Augustine wrote centuries ago, there are those whom God has that the church does not have. And there are those the church has who God does not have. Kingdom people are united with the rule of God in trying to build a world most of us would like to see happen. It is very much something for the here and now, or as Jesus himself said, the kingdom of God is at hand. But here again, Jesus was going against the flow. In his time, one of the most firmly held Israelite expectations was that the kingdom of God would manifest the final triumph of God in history. Its arrival, heralded by the long-awaited Messiah, would rescue Israel from its miserable subservience to the Roman Empire. It was a kingdom of the future, not one in the here and now. But Jesus turns this expectation on its head. His parables about the kingdom imply that we can find God in everyday life. We do not have to wait for an apocalyptic deliverance. We do not have to wait for a grandiose liberation. The kingdom of God is available right now. If we try to live as disciples of Jesus, dedicated to making his kingdom a reality, that is, if we lead a holy life as opposed to a merely respectable one, we may lose many of our friends and relatives. Why? Because it's a challenge to follow Jesus. We won't just be going along with the crowd. We might get one or two of them to follow our example, but it is like the mustard seed. We may get a very modest result, but our efforts may end up looking more like a small bush than a mighty redwood tree. All we are likely to get is an inconspicuous shrub of which there are plenty of others around in great variety. In fact, the mustard seed is just one step ahead of being an ordinary weed, as most gardeners would say. How are we to understand this deliberate use by Jesus of something so insignificant as an image of his kingdom? It suggests that God's greatest works are not done on a grandiose level, not in cathedrals, huge organizations, or some version of so-called Christian nationalism. Such things can become monuments to human accomplishment and human ego, rather than sources of inspiration for the Christian community. The kingdom is in everyday life, with its ups and downs, and above all, in its insignificance. Such is where most people actually live their lives. And the kingdom is readily accessible right there to everybody. This parable is saying that grace, another name for the life of God, is like a mustard seed sown in us. It is growing, but it is not going to turn us into a redwood tree. We will be doing well if we become a modest shrub. Where are the mightiest works of the kingdom accomplished? First, in our attitudes and our thinking. Second, in our actions, especially our charitable actions, however small, because where there is charity, there is God. Opportunities to help the homeless, the hungry, the aging, the sick, the lonely are all around us. No one else may notice our good deeds. Indeed, we may not give much thought to them ourselves as they become increasingly natural and spontaneous. The kingdom of God manifests itself in the modest changes in our attitudes and in the small, barely noticeable improvements in our behavior. But these, not great external accomplishments, are the mighty works of God. Today's gospel is about those everyday miracles we can accomplish if we possess mustard seed faith. The conviction that in our smallest acts of compassion and generosity, love and mercy, we can transform the most barren stretches of our lives or others' lives into gardens of hope and possibility. We may have little or no expectation of a harvest. Nurturing what we have planted may be a frustrating and futile undertaking. But Christ calls us to embrace the faith of the gospel farmer and the hope of the mustard seed, to be willing to plant whatever seeds of gospel hope and compassion that we possess, wherever and whenever we can, in the certain knowledge that it will, in some way, result in its own miracle, the revelation of the kingdom of God in the midst of the ordinariness and the blessedness of our everyday lives. And in the words of the French philosopher and Jesuit priest Teilhard de Chardin, trust in the slow work of God. Thanks for listening.